My Lords, in his devastating book, How Westminster Works and Why It Doesn't, the noted commentator Ian Dunt describes this House, I quote, as one of the only aspects of our constitutional arrangements that actually works. The words he, as a neutral observer, uses to describe this House include diligence, expertise, consensus, seriousness, independence, a willingness to stand up to the government.
Quiet Riot.
Welcome to Quiet Riot Sunday School, the turkey curry to Thursday's lunch with all the trimmings.
Hallelujah.
Hallelujah. I'm Alex.
And I'm Naomi, the corpse bride to Alex's nightmare before Christmas.
Oh, poor love, what is wrong?
I've got the lurgy. This used to happen to me when I was at school, that I'd keep going all through term, and then as soon as term ended, I'd get tonsillitis or something.
Oh.
And for the last few years, I've been so lucky. I've, got to the end of the first term back and the house rises and we all breathe a sigh of relief. And I have been amazed that I haven't been ill. This year, I have not got away with it. I have definitely burnt the candle at both ends a little bit too much.
That happens because I think adrenaline can sometimes keep you going and actually overtax your immune system. And then as soon as the adrenaline is gone,
bang.
Bang.
Yeah.
Listen, maybe it's a good thing. Maybe it will force you to actually rest.
I haven't done a thing for 2 days, I promise.
Yeah.
Well, I did look at a little bit of polling that came back. That is not entirely true. And another bit of work. But other than that, for me, I have definitely switched
You sound better than you did this morning and definitely better than you did last night. So
anyway, with me having terrible brain fog and needing to recover so that the whole of Christmas isn't a complete wipeout for me, we asked for help from our most extraordinary community of knowledgeable friends, and they've sprung up to support and step in for me in this last news-related episode of the year. Alex, who have you chatted with and what about?
Right, so the first topic we have to cover is the atrocious attack in Germany. And I chatted to our friend Arthur Snell about it. We tend to emphasize his diplomatic credentials and his diplomatic past, but he also used to head the Foreign Office contribution to the Prevent program.
Yep.
So he's incredibly well placed to update us on this. I also wanted to talk compensation for WASPI women because it's an issue on which, as I know you do, I feel quite genuinely conflicted. The brilliant Zoe Williams helped me clarify my thoughts a little bit, as I hope she will yours when you listen. There is the whole matter of the first cracks appearing in the Trump-Musk relationship over the budget bill.
Even sooner than even you had potentially anticipated.
And just as Farage and Reform seem to be throwing their lot in with Musk as well, which I think is another interesting dynamic. What happens if they've hitched their wagon to that star and that relationship breaks down? I'm not sure. And on this, there is no better person to help us pick through than transparency campaigner Peter Geoghegan. So I'm chatting to him about that. And as it happens, today's episode is sponsored by his newsletter, as you will hear in the read halfway through the episode.
Thank you very much, Peter. I think you might also have one other surprise up your sleeve.
Do you sense that?
I feel like maybe there might be a little angel on the top of the Christmas tree.
It is nearly Christmas, so there is the small matter of Lord's appointments.
Sorry, I'm feeling even worse. I'm suddenly feeling even worse.
The life peerages that were just announced. And I don't think anyone can speak to this with more authority than a man who is now quoted in the Lords. Oh, yes, it is the return of the Dunt.
Right, let's get into it. Quiet Riot.
We start with a horrific attack in Germany on the Christmas market in Magdeburg. According to the latest official briefing, as we record on Saturday evening, there are 5 fatalities, one of them a 9-year-old boy, and over 200 injured, 40 critically. Why the Daily Mail went with a front page confidently declaring 11 dead on Friday night before any such information was available, I do not know. The suspect, we know, entered the market via an ambulance access. He was arrested on the scene. Police intervened 3 minutes into the attack. He is identified as Talib A, a Saudi psychiatrist who arrived in Germany seeking asylum in 2006 and was granted it a decade ago. He was not known to security services and has no links to Islamist extremism. He was an outspoken critic of Islam on social media and amplified conspiracy theories about an Islamist domination of Europe. He has called for Angela Merkel to be jailed for life, since there is no death penalty in Germany, those are his words, for her, again his words, secret project to Islamize Europe. He has vocally supported Elon Musk and Tommy Robinson as victims of liberal censorship and has publicly supported the far-right party Alternative für Deutschland, or AfD, on several occasions. I spoke to former diplomat and extremism expert Arthur Snell to get his thoughts on this preliminary tranche of information.
Hi, Alex.
It's a horrific attack, obviously, but it's also an incredibly peculiar one from various security angles, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously with these things, news unfolds gradually. In the first instance, people heard that it was a Saudi national and people jumped to a conclusion that it was some kind of Islamist attack, which is not unreasonable. You know, almost everybody in Saudi Arabia is a Muslim. So, you know, that's a starting point. But what we've got actually is a very unusual case of a Saudi who has asylum in Germany because he is an anti-Muslim Saudi Arabian, which in itself is a very unusual sort of thing to be. You might have people who don't practice, but he is opposed to Islam. He appears to have been motivated by a very strange sense that Germany is being taken over by Muslims. Of course, Germany famously took 1 million Syrian refugees. Some of the kind of right-wing culture war stuff, he speaks warmly of Elon Musk and Tommy Robinson, so this kind of anti-Islam culture war stuff that we see. And ultimately, probably just a classic example of self-radicalisation, which is something that now happens. People in a very isolated way online can kind of be drawn into a very sort of personal version of a murderous and dangerous ideology. But I guess the final thing to mention is that attacks on German Christmas markets, of course, were carried out by ISIS sympathizers. So in that sense, this person is playing into a certain sort of trope that already exists probably in the minds of many German people.
And this is, I think, part of the reason why, when the initial details of the attack were disseminated, a lot of people, I think, rowed a long way offshore and tried to, as we see very often in this kind of situation, try to kind of claim the high ground very, very quickly.
Yeah. Absolutely. So you have this thing where people say, this proves what I've always been saying. And of course, it comes right in the days that Elon Musk has started to intervene in German politics, speaking in favor of AfD, which of course is the hard right, anti-Muslim political party that is particularly popular in East Germany, which is where this, or the former East Germany, sorry, which is where this attack took place. And the attacker is known to be a supporter of that party. So it's almost as if the incident was designed. I'm not suggesting a conspiracy, but you couldn't have imagined an incident that would be more would have a greater impact on an existing very fraught political situation in Germany.
And a really unpredictable one, because the factual matrix you have in terms of to whom might people apportion blame is really complicated, because you have the Socialist Democrats, the SPD, in charge of the coalition federal government, but the CDU, the Christian Democrats, are in charge of this particular region of Germany, Saxony.
Yeah.
And the AfD did incredibly well in the most recent sort of local elections in similar areas. And this is the kind of area they would hope to make significant advances in. So I guess over the next few days, people will have to make a judgment as to what camp deserves to basically be held responsible for this, right?
One imagines that the original decision to give this person asylum in Germany, if he was somebody who had renounced his birth religion of Islam and was firmly opposed to the Saudi government, sits in a fairly kind of conventional liberal European space where you have small numbers of dissidents probably genuinely aren't very safe in their home country. And certainly it was not a safe thing to do, to be a Saudi at that time who had publicly said, I'm anti-Islam. Obviously, one could use that to attack the traditional, what you might call the establishment German parties. But on the other hand, this is somebody who's a supporter of AfD. And I think whilst it's a slightly bewildering case, it's a fairly neat illustration of the way that radicalization has become a profound danger. You know, we've seen lots of political violence in America, which comes from the far right. We've seen some of it in other parts of Europe, including in this country. And, you know, you don't have to have pale skin and Aryan looks to be radicalized into far right ideology. And that's sort of, in a way, blindingly obvious.
Yes, it makes a sort of bizarre internal logic, right?
Yeah.
To say, I came to this country to avoid Muslims.
Yes.
And now you're letting in too many. I think what doesn't make sense, to me at least, is then the decision to attack a Christmas market, to sort of lean into that stereotype and that. What's your assessment of that?
Yeah, that's very confusing because obviously, as I mentioned, you know, and people will know that ISIS and others have attacked Christmas markets. And of course, Christmas markets in Germany are a deeply rooted cultural phenomenon. You know, they're not just some thing that's been set up in the last few years. So they're part of Germany's historic, undoubtedly Christian heritage, which doesn't mean that they're not safe spaces for other faiths and cultures in the modern era, but clearly that's where they come from. So what's going on there? I mean, yes, from what I've understood, obviously I can't claim I've known about this guy, but he's argued that there are too many Syrians in Germany, it's all been taken over, and I suppose maybe there was something about this market that he felt had become sort of multicultural in a way that was unacceptable. But of course, the other problem is that it comes back to this individual self-radicalization. And I think, Alex, when we were discussing earlier, you drew my attention to a post from Peter Neumann, who's a very distinguished German expert on radicalization, more or less sort of saying, in all my years of doing this, I never thought this sort of thing would happen. But you can end up with people with very bizarre, uniquely generated private views. And I suppose if we think a little bit about the January the 6th insurrection, which of course, you know, took place at the end of Trump's first presidency, a lot of people with very individually wacky views showed up. But overall, they had a sort of general view that the election had been stolen. But there was a lot of very distinct, remember the QAnon shaman, you know, there are all these different things. And I guess that is a feature that in a way, the era of rather conventional radicalization, where people took an existing faith and then took it to a far extreme and sort of used that to justify violence, the sort of jihadist radicalization, that in a way perhaps was rather simpler than what we're seeing now, which is this very chaotic and complex kind of personal journey radicalization.
Yeah. One of the people that did row a long way ashore was Elon Musk.
Yeah.
As you mentioned, who demanded immediately that Olaf Scholz resign.
Yeah.
Which did remind me of what happened during the riots here.
Yeah.
When he basically called for Keir Starmer to go.
Yes.
And it comes also at a time when he's getting more and more involved in our domestic politics.
Yeah.
We saw photos of him with Nigel Farage. He is clearly determined to mess with British politics. I think that much is clear. Does that also illustrate the dangers of attaching yourself to someone quite so fringe, quite so leap before you think, for reform? He's now a vocal supporter of the AfD.
Yeah.
And let's remind ourselves that the AfD is someone with whom Marine Le Pen just severed links in the European Parliament because she thought that they were far too extreme. So I guess what I'm asking is this at some point going to connect into a whole, or is it going to completely fragment?
Yeah, I mean, one would hope, of course, that a lot of people who, let's say, in this country are a few years ago would have thought of themselves as fairly mainstream conservatives and have now been drawn towards reform. And obviously, I won't share those people's views, but I hope that I wouldn't regard them as fascists, that they might look at this and think, oh, hang on a minute, are we going down a bit of a dark tunnel here? There are two problems. One is the English-speaking world has got very limited energy for concerning itself with the details of who particular foreign people are and what they might believe. And if you're already of a view that, Elon Musk is finally saying the things that need to be said and that sort of stuff, so that if you've already decided that he's making a positive rather than a highly damaging contribution to the public debate, then I suppose you see him endorsing AfD as just further evidence of that. The thing with Musk is that, yes, he may have a sophisticated team of political advisors helping him, but I don't think the evidence for that is there. I think this is one bloke who may or may not be chemically enhanced in some of his insights and appears to just alight on things that he then obsesses over. He has a very high IQ, I've no doubt of that, and he's clearly somebody who's capable of imbibing a lot of information quickly, but one wonders what sources he's relying on now. And I just wonder whether he suddenly woke up to German politics. As you say, he was very into British politics, and there he was, talking about the civil war that was going to begin here, which was inevitable. Well, obviously, we're happy to note it, in spite of its inevitability, is yet to begin. But I wonder whether he's just woken up to the fact that Germany is the most imminent election in a major Western country, and he's suddenly thinking, oh wow, I can switch German politics because that's what I was able to do in America. And it's like a child suddenly finding that they've got some power they didn't know they had.
We'll see how this all shakes out. Our thoughts are obviously with the people affected by that horrific attack and the emergency responders and German people in general. Our solidarity goes out to you. Arthur, thank you so much for throwing a little bit of light on the information as we have it at the moment as we record on Saturday evening. I'm sure the story will develop very quickly. And a very, very happy holiday. I hope you have a restful break. Well, I hope we're all allowed to have a break, because I think part of the problem with this stuff going on is that it sucks oxygen out of a period that is meant to be a little bit for softening up and recharging our batteries and resting a little bit. It's part, I think, of what makes politics right now an incredibly charged field. So I am grateful for your time more than usual.
Well, it's always my pleasure. I wish we could talk about something different, but yeah, this is an important and tragic story. So I share those views that you've just expressed.
Quiet riot. Quiet riot.
In the wee hours of Saturday morning, shortly before 1 a.m., Senate finally approved a bill to avert government shutdown in the United States by a margin of 85 to 11, hours after the House passed the measure by a vote of 366 in favor to 34 against, and one member voting present, with more Democrats voting to support it than Republicans. The bill now heads to President Biden for his signature. The measure extends current government funding through March 14th and provides $100 billion in disaster relief funds and $10 billion in aid to farmers. It does not address the debt ceiling, something Trump had demanded during the tumultuous back and forth over the course of the week. This was the third attempt to pass a bill. The first had been co-drafted in a bipartisan way, reportedly with Trump's blessing. But Elon Musk started agitating against it on Wednesday morning, and by Wednesday evening, when it became clear that he had moved enough GOP support against it, Trump toed the line and also opposed it, and it failed. Then Musk and Trump demanded the debt ceiling be raised for 2 years or abolished altogether, which took a lot of Republicans by surprise. A slimmed-down version of the bill was also rejected, but then an even more bare-bones deal was accepted. Trump has been silent about this third version so far. Musk has questioned whether it is even a Republican bill. Speaker Johnson said he had been in contact with Musk and asked him whether he wanted to be Speaker. Jokes were circulating publicly about President Musk, even among Republicans. I spoke to transparency campaigner Peter Geoghegan, a happy coincidence since today's episode is sponsored by the excellent Democracy for Sale Substack, which he co-authors, about whether we are seeing the first cracks in the Trump-Musk bromance, and what this means for parties like Reform, who have thrown their lot in with the tech oligarch. So, Peter, what do you think is going on here? Because there are two versions of events. One is the sort of quite generous version that says, ooh, they really played 4D chess. But that's not supported by the result, because they didn't actually get what they wanted, which is the debt ceiling raised for 2 years or abolished altogether, so they could do whatever they want once Trump is inaugurated. The other version is that we are seeing the first cracks in their relationship.
Well, yeah, it's very interesting, Alex. And actually, on a personal note, I was actually I have some business to do in the United States Embassy in a couple of days to do with passports. I was actually going, will it be open? Will the US Embassy in London be open? Because will the government shut down? And what's happened is that Congress has passed spending legislation. It's going to, so it means we won't have a government shutdown. And in many respects, you can see some cracks in this Musk-Trump coalition because Musk has been pretty vocal in his opposition. And, this was the third attempt to pass the bill. This Musk-Trump axis, which was so important in getting Trump elected, I think it's been a really important thing. And it looks like it's going to set the scene for what the next 4 years look like. This suggests something slightly different. And as you say, it might be something, really, really deeply thought out, but actually often where Trump is concerned and where decisions are concerned, it doesn't work like that. And we have already seen some evidence from some of Trump's picks that he has picked some people into key jobs who Musk has actually been pretty vocal about not liking. It shows on the one hand that Musk is a real player in the Republican circles. And it's worth remembering he has warned Republicans in Congress that anybody who doesn't toe the Trump line, that he will primary them. He will use his money to have a primary against them, which they will probably lose, and a Musk-Trump candidate will emerge. So that he is a real threat against them. But what this shows that when it comes to actual hard politics, it's not as if Musk can actually just do whatever he wants.
And that's, I guess, what makes it interesting. I mean, my very first take on this relationship was that it had definite Johnson-Cummings vibes and would end badly. But the big difference, of course, is that Cummings doesn't have any real power. He was just an advisor. I guess he has a little bit of dirt on people. He has a little bit of influence behind the scenes. But he doesn't have real power in the way Musk does, because he has a lot of money and a lot of influence and a social network of his own. If this breaks down, it will be a lot more spectacular, I think, and a lot more a fight to the death between the two than Johnson-Cummings was.
Yeah, I think what you're talking about with Johnson and Cummings, you're talking about this kind of eminence Greece character. Cummings was somebody that I would talk about, so you would talk about, people who listen to Quiet Riot podcasts would talk about. But, to ordinary people on the street, Cummings was probably still some of they didn't really know that much about, even still a few years later. These days, I think he's on Substack, furiously writing 10,000 word screeds about Bismarck and the things he likes to do. They don't really have an impact. Musk is very different. Musk is the richest man in the world. He is someone who controls a social media platform that he's shown a willingness to push his political agenda on. Like just in the last few days, we have him tweeting furiously about the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland, and how they can save Germany, an incredibly far-right party. So he has his own political ambitions in a way that it felt like with Cummings that was a different space. That Cummings was not that character. So if Musk and Trump were to, if there was to be some sort of conscious uncoupling, to use the phrase, this would be quite spectacular. But also what it would mean politically might be quite hard to trace, because Musk is showing a huge willingness to use his money for political causes. And he has so much money that he could be a very effective political player.
And we are seeing him very actively seeking to become involved in British politics and fund the Reform Party, who have published photos of the new big funder and treasurer of the party, property tycoon Candy. We saw a photo of him and Farage meeting Musk in Mar-a-Lago, I think it was, And so there is something actively going on there. I have seen a lot of people basically arguing that we need to tighten donation laws and tighten them now. And this is a subject we discussed when you were recently on the show. I have seen some other people saying that if we change donation rules, they must come into effect after the next election, because to do it now, essentially, specifically to stop Musk donating, would feed into the reform narrative, their victimhood status that UK politics is a closed shop, and see what they're trying to do, and actually boost them.
I think there's two things going on here that are kind of worth separating out. So you've got the issue of Musk and reform, and you saw, Nick Candy, very interesting choice as treasurer. And just for listeners, treasurer when it comes to political parties, it's not like a charity. The treasurer accounts to make sure the pennies and the pounds match up. The treasurer for a political party tends to be someone, a big donor who brings money in. So we saw with the Tories that every treasurer who brought in £3 million who donated £3 million went to the House of Lords. Reform are following a similar agenda. Nick Candy is saying, I'm going to give money, and he's going to go out and try and raise more money on the back of it. And he's hoping that Musk will help him do that. So what you've got is one issue here, which is about the laws that allow this to happen, and the politics of that as well. And I think there is definitely an issue there where you've got this sense in which people might feel like, actually, this isn't right, you're changing the rules of the game as it's already started. This is why it's been such a problem, actually. I think that Labour has its communications and, frankly, its strategy on this issue has been so poor. Labour, before the last election, if you look at their manifesto, they talk about ending sleaze. They made a commitment to a new elections bill. Previously, Labour said they were going to set up an ethics and integrity commission to regulate British politics better. They've hinted at changes to electoral law. They've hinted at wanting to take money out of politics. And had Labour gone on the front foot on this issue, as frankly people like I were saying back in July, this is an issue, guys, you can own. One of the reasons people are so skeptic about politics is because they don't like money in politics.
And it's an eye-catching issue that costs almost no money to implement, Peter, which is why it's annoying that they didn't go on the front foot on this. It is the equivalent of Blair giving independence to the Bank of England. It cost nothing, but it signalled a sort of period of change. It signalled an intent.
Exactly. And Labour's failure to do that, I think, has put them in this position where they look as if they're being reactive, which they are, and they still don't have a strategy. So Labour are briefing, when the Musk story first broke, they were briefing that they might cap political donations. Now they're briefing that they will do something by 2026. As we're speaking, the chair of the Commission on Standards in Public Life, which is basically kind of the ethics watchdog for Keir Starmer, he said we should do something about limiting the amount of money that companies can give. This is all really piecemeal and really reactive and isn't being led from the front. And unfortunately, this is something I think we're seeing, especially around this issue of transparency and accountability in politics, that Labour aren't leading from the front. We saw with all that kind of gift-gate, as it was called, where instead of coming out with a strong line about donations to politicians, and they ended up arguing every single gift. I still don't think it's too late for them to come out and say, look, we have said this before. They have a track record on this. They have said these things publicly. But as it currently stands, Labour looks like it's being reactive. It could feed into a populist narrative. I think the time to act on this, if they're going to act, is actually sooner rather than later. We're still quite a long way from a general election. This issue, I think, would fade if they were to do something now. I think the much bigger danger is we get to a place where we're 12 months out from a general election or even less, and it's very clear this sort of thing is going to happen. This sort of money is going to come flooding in. It's already flooding in, and Labour then acts and looks like it's stitching it up.
There is also another school of thought to this, which I wonder what you think about it. There are political commentators I respect who are saying that if Musk comes in with a lot of money, that might help reform sort of reach the next tier, but it might also set a sort of ceiling for them, because there is a feeling that the British voting public, a large chunk of the British voting public, will not like the idea of some foreign billionaire coming in and basically deciding to buy the election. And I have some instinctive sympathy with that this kind of thing might take them to 20 or 22%, but they might struggle to get above that. What do you think of that?
Money doesn't necessarily buy you success in politics. If you look at the US election, Trump was out fundraised by Kamala Harris more than 2-1. She raised well over $1 billion in a really short space of time. It probably helped the Democrats a little bit in some of these down ticket races in some swing states, for sure. But it certainly wasn't transformative in that she lost. And so in the same case in the UK, often what we've seen from political donors is they give money because they want something. And they want access to something. I've written about, PPE contracts for VIP political donors. We've seen access stories, been a huge aspect of British politics for a very long time. People like me and others, lots of journalists often writing about access stories. That's what donors often want. In the case of Musk, he's actually trying, I don't think it's about access for Musk in Britain.
No, he's trying to change the political landscape worldwide, it seems, basically.
Completely. And that's what he's trying to do. And the extent to which that's possible by spending his money is, I think I would agree. I think there is a point at which, if it looks like Farage has completely been bankrolled by the US, we've just seen that Farage is now going to be involved with this, a UK version of the Heartland Institute, which is another very hard right, climate skeptic, American organization, really notorious for climate denial. Sorry, not skeptic, denial. In the US, Farage is going to front that up here in the UK, it looks like. Again, that's aligning himself with lots of people that I think, I would agree, a lot of British voters wouldn't have a huge amount of time for that. And if you look at approval ratings for Trump or support for Trump in Britain, is much higher than it was back in 2016. Mm-hmm. But it's still very much a minority sport.
And that's another interesting hostage to fortune, I think. A relationship that looks as if it might be quite volatile, and an administration that might succeed, but it might also spectacularly fail, 2 years down the line might not look like such a smart thing.
This is the issue, and there's every chance the next UK general election will happen after the next US presidential election. So a lot of water will have passed under the bridge. And I think this is, I come at this issue really from the kind of accountability and transparency side of it. Like, I think we have seen time and again how unlimited donations, how dirty money and dark money in British politics has warped the political agenda. And in some ways, Musk, I just think, is really he's almost like unintentionally illuminating this, shining a great massive light onto this. And it's a problem that the public care about. And I think that, to me, is the most compelling reason to act, rather than its party political or other ramifications. I think that's it's not a good reason not to do something. But as you say, it's not hard to kind of create a narrative where reform are almost imperious and success is guaranteed, and Farage has all this money from Musk and he's next to Trump. A lot could change, as you say, in the next 4 years. A hell of a lot. I think this will be very useful for reform in fundraising from other people. And I think that's what the Candy thing is about, really. It's going to be a lot easier. Candy used to be a big Tory donor. They're going to want to flip all these Tory donors who've deserted the Tory party because the Tory party are nowhere near power. And it could be very useful for reform to really build up a war chest even without Musk.
Peter, thank you very, very much. Brilliant to chat to you as always.
Thank you so much, Alex, and have a great holidays.
You too. Now, before we go on, a public service announcement of sorts. After Peter's guest appearance last week, I've been binging on the back catalogue of his brilliant Substack newsletter, Democracy for Sale. It's just two journalists, Peter Geoghegan and Lucas Armin, focused on dark money and hidden influence, whether it's Tufton Street and the billionaires funding the Conservatives, or Elon Musk and Nigel Farage. Democracy for Sale is digging deep to find out what's really going on. Their stories have already prompted parliamentary inquiries, regulatory action and forced accountability on major corporations, and there's a lot more to come, he promises. You can find all of this at democracyforsale.substack.com. I'll drop the link in the notes too. Very much like this podcast, Peter and Lucas make all of their content freely available, so do yourself a favour and subscribe today. Democracy doesn't just maintain itself, it needs our engagement. That's democracyforsale.substack.com.
Quiet Riot.
In 1995, the then Conservative government introduced a timetable to make the age at which men and women start getting state pensions the same. The state pension age for women would gradually rise to 65, as for men, between 2010 and 2020. This affected 3.6 million women born in the 50s primarily. In 2011, the Conservative-led coalition decided to speed up the changes, bringing forward the qualifying age of 65 for women to 2018, which affected 2.6 million of those women. They formed the campaign group Women Against State Pension Inequality, hence the acronym WASPI. In March, the Parliamentary and Health Service Ombudsman found maladministration in how the changing pension age was communicated by government. But it also found that 90% of affected women did know about the change. There was just no way of determining which ones. So it recommended all women be paid between £1,000 and £2,950 each, a bill that would cost the Treasury over £10 billion. The Sunak government indicated to the Ombudsman that it would reject the recommendation. The Starmer government has, but this has caused a huge backlash as several senior members of the then shadow front bench had indicated support for the WASPI women. I spoke to Guardian columnist and Quiet Riot regular Zoe Williams about the rights and wrongs of this really complicated matter. Hi, Zoe.
Hi, Alex. Happy Christmas.
Yes, you too. And thanks for stepping in. Naomi's very, very grateful. WASPI women, I wanted to get your view because it's one of those that I'm really ambivalent about and actually pulled in all kinds of directions. And I'm hoping maybe together we can find some clarity. What do you think about it all?
Well, so listen, there's no point having a parliamentary ombudsman if you don't listen to their findings, right? And the ombudsman has already found ages ago that the women were treated unjustly, that if the government's going to have a change of policy, it needs to communicate that change, and they weren't communicated with. So those findings have been found. There's no arguing it. All I would say alongside that is a load of people were stiffed by the coalition government and the Conservative government's succeeding it. A load of people were stiffed by them, whether that's directly stiffed by policies that weren't communicated, whether policies were made that were later found to be unfair. There were so many benefits changes that were taken to court were then found to be unlawful, not in aggregate, but in the individual decisions. I think at one point the DWP's decisions were being found wrong in 60% of cases. So you've got to consider that all the people who couldn't face going to court because their health wasn't good enough were really, really badly treated. And I'm just not sure that I disagree with Reeves, that they're not necessarily the priority.
I'll tell you why I'm pulled in different ways. The first thing is that I'm not 100% sure in my mind of the absolute merit of the case. And that's for a very specific reason, because yes, the Ombudsman found that the government had made mistakes in the way it communicated the change, but it was only a small percentage of people that weren't aware of it. And there's no way of just identifying them so you can compensate them. So you would end up compensating basically a whole load of people that knew about the change, and possibly a whole load of people that don't particularly need this money. Contrast that with what you were talking about, the sub-postmasters or the infected blood scandal. And if you look at it as a ladder of priorities, in my mind, that issue would be a lower priority.
I think you're right. I mean, that's really difficult because when the winter fuel payments when that announcement was first made, I was thinking, to be honest, I'm not devastated by that because there are a huge number of pensioners who don't need that money. I'd failed to engage. There were loads of people on the breadline who were just the wrong side of the breadline and were also going to lose the payment. So I think what's a shame for Reeves is that she comes off like this person who's absolutely all over detail, who lives for detail. But a lot of these plans are are not that well formulated at the moment. The winter fuel payment withdrawal hasn't been well enough formulated to match who needs it and who doesn't. And I'm not sure just saying a blanket no to the WASPI women is the right thing to do. But then, to bring in two other things first, I really feel like this government is being just treated absolutely atrociously by the commentariat, because the Conservatives and the coalition government before them introduced waves of hardship, disgusting stories. The benefit sanctions regime on its own caused people to genuinely starve to death. And there was very rarely even a peep about that, especially from the Murdoch.
No, the double standard is infuriating. There's no doubt about it. The thing that pulls me in the opposite direction, though, is the fact that it does feel as if Labour and senior people in Labour did mislead those women into believing that they were going to get some compensation. And I'm not entirely sure it was cynical, to be completely honest. I think a lot of people, me included, to be honest, right at the start of the WASPI story, just saw a group that was being victimized, and it was a group that I was sympathetic to, and so I was on board with it, if that makes sense. So I didn't really know much about the detail, and I think it can be hard for a position not to jump on a bandwagon occasionally when they see a lot of political hate to be made of it.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, we are living through a time where there is very little goodwill towards politics and politicians, and a widespread belief that they lie and they only look after themselves and they use voters, but voters never get what they were promised. And my concern is that this kind of thing, yes, it might be a huge bill, but the bill for democracy, the bill for belief in our politics, the bill for cynicism, the bill for possibly elevating reform even further, might be even bigger.
Well, I mean, Jesus. The thing is, I don't think anything would be enough to restore trust in democracy. You could say, okay, WASPI women, we stood with them when we were in opposition. We've got to make good on our promises now, or we've created a constituency of people who hate us. But the promises were so diffuse and so enormous. There was a kind of, Labour came in on a promise of completely restored government, of a state that works, of people feeling better off, of people feeling that they weren't being kind of, stiffed every single where they turned. And I don't think they are going to make good on any of that. I don't think people are feeling like, phew, thank God the grown-ups are in charge and I already feel more secure. So making these fine calculations about constituencies that you're not going to alienate is, it's a long shot, is all I can say. If the bill's going to be £10 billion and it's going to go to people who might not necessarily need it and might not necessarily deserve it, because as you say, 90% of women in this band did know about the changes. So if you compensate all of them, that's 9 in 10 getting money that isn't warranted.
Yes, you're right. And I guess the only bright spark that I can hold on to, thinking about it, is that these are calculations that had we had a Conservative government still in, they wouldn't even make.
No, exactly.
It would just be no to everyone, and the money would go to some tax cut for
some friend
corporations or whatever. Yeah, exactly.
I mean, that's what's so demoralizing, is that, they did besmirch the reputation of politicians for good reason, that they did see that it was an incredibly cronyist, corrupt period in office. And even before the kind of COVID corruption crept in, there was a real sense of fecklessness, not just from Boris Johnson, but the whole Brexit era was defined by this sort of fecklessness about the day-to-day running of people's lives. So you went from austerity, which was often just performative cruelty, into Brexit, in which all parliamentary time was taken with nonsense, and then into COVID, which was defined by a lot of corruption. And I just worry that did taint the business parliamentary reputation so profoundly that it's really hard to see how it rectifies over a single term.
And you've now ended up with a spectacle of an opposition sort of looking at 25 billion lost from the economy to Brexit, going, oh, that's nothing, it's a rounding error, while at the same time sort of going, why won't you give X amount of money for the winter fuel allowance?
I really love the idea of this podcast as like a stealth anti-Brexit campaign.
I mean, look, any way you cut it, Zoe, the fact remains that the basic difficulty faced by the government right now is that a lot of people were stitched up and there's not enough money to unstitch them.
Yeah.
And part of why there isn't enough money to unstitch them is Brexit. There's just no getting away from that. And especially in a situation where we are looking at a world in which China, the EU, and the US are about to do tariffs battles, I mean, we're fucked.
I don't know. I kind of take quite a bit of heart from the nonsense with America, because I do think that when the case for closer relations with the European Union becomes pressing and urgent, something's got to give, right? Somebody's going to have some sense and come in and say, okay, this is silly. We've just got to repair. That's my hope anyway. I haven't given up on that.
Yeah, okay. But maybe that someone will be Farage saying, let's join America as the 52nd state.
Okay.
Anyway.
Shut up.
Thank you for giving up your time and have the happiest of holidays and the most stressful of breaks. My darling Zoe, thank you.
Always a pleasure to speak to you. I'll see you in the new year.
Quiet, Ryan. Quiet, Ryan.
End-of-year peerage nominations were published on Friday. Labour has recommended 30 names, the Conservatives 6 and the Liberal Democrats 2. A series of former Labour MPs who lost their seats or stood down in recent elections will now join the House of Lords, including Thangam de Bonaire, Julie Elliott, Lynn Brown, Steve McCabe, Luciana Berger, Phil Wilson and Margaret Curran. The list eye-catchingly includes former senior civil servant Sue Gray, who stepped down as Starmer's Chief of Staff just a couple of months ago. Tory appointments included former Liz Truss Deputy Therese Coffey and controversial culture warrior Toby Young. The list has set tongues wagging in Whitehall because, having made promises to reform the second chamber, then watered them down, Labour appear to be doing the very thing of which they accused others. Labour says it is still committed to a programme of reform and has laid down legislation to start that process. But in the meantime, the Conservatives, having stuffed the House of Lords with cronies, created a serious imbalance that needed to be corrected, or government legislation would not get a fair shake. I wondered what friend of the podcast, Ian Dunt, a supporter of the work the House of Lords does in its current form, made of all this. Hi, Ian.
Hello.
You're here to chat to me about the slate of Lords appointments of life peers that's just been announced. As a neutral observer and noted commentator on the Lords, there could only be you, really. So I wonder how you feel, because you know I'm not a massive supporter of the Lords as a chamber anyway, and I know you quite like them. But what do you think of this latest round of appointments?
Well, I'm gutted that he did it, really. I mean, Labour's policy on the Lords has just been a godforsaken mess. When they said that they were going to abolish it and replace it with an elected chamber, I was in despair about that, because I just thought it'd be a disastrous idea. But more importantly, I was sort of like, what are you doing over there? Like, have you done any research into the areas that you plan to reform? And then they pulled back on that. And now they've gone too far in the other direction and not instituted any reform at all. Like, really, we cannot just have Prime Minister after Prime Minister come in and just cram the place with their cronies, basically, with loyalists and people who they think will be loyal and people they want to reward for having been loyal, and just see the size of it just expand and expand and expand without any check on the people that are being introduced into it. And even for those of us who are defenders of the Lords, who think it's basically the best institution operating in Westminster, it makes our job impossible, because you just cannot support this stuff. You cannot defend the way that they're behaving. So toxifies the image of one of the few viable institutions that remains in Westminster. I'm gutted that Starmer did it, to be honest. It's not surprising, but it is bitterly disappointing.
Yeah, I mean, their counter-argument would be, this is a chamber that's already stuffed full of Tories, basically. And if we are to not have every piece of legislation gummed up, we need to redress the balance while we go ahead with reform. And I guess in their defense, like looking at the list of appointments, they are quite experienced legislators and policymakers. You know, it's not that I don't see the same names that I saw in Johnson's list when you look at them and you think, who's that? You know, what's their experience? What's their expertise? Why are they in the Lords?
100%. So the individuals themselves are far more impressive than they were under the Conservatives. So Luciana Berger is a good choice. Sue Gray, I mean, that's its own fucking psychodrama right there. But she is a good choice. Like, she will function well in the Lords. She'll be an impressive person to read legislation and scrutinize it. Thungam Debonair, I mean, there's always something a little bit grim about someone losing their seat in an election and then just being slotted into the Lords anyway. But I like Thungam Debonair. I think she's impressive and I think she'll do good work there. And the same with Deborah Matheson. So these are all really quite impressive women in particular for the big names. I can see why he's putting them in there. That doesn't change the fact that no prime minister should have the power to put people into the Lords like they're some kind of feudal monarch. I don't believe in democratic choices for people in the Lords, but I do believe in having the House Appointments Commission just actually doing the work, selecting the people and having power of veto over the people who are there. Labour has introduced no reform except to say that they have to come with a one-paragraph explanation of why the person is being nominated. That's just not enough. That doesn't mean anything. It doesn't prevent what we saw under Johnson, under Truss, of party donors being given places, of people that the security services were warning about because of their connections with Russia being given places. Now is the time for constitutional reform, and Labour is not doing it. It's never going to do it in its second term. Governments don't have the thorniness of constitutional reform, is never something that they have any appetite for there. Now is the time, and they've given it up. On your second point, I mean, stuff for the Tories. Look, here's the thing. Tories do not have a majority in the House of Lords. No party has a majority in the House of Lords. The reason that it functions so well is because there is no government majority. So basically, instead of just being able to force through the legislation, instead of being able to ignore amendments, you actually have to convince people of your case. So on that basis, all we're going to get is this perpetual ramming in of individuals to try and keep the levels stable. We do not need to operate it in this way. We can have it with no party having control, no government having a majority, but remove it from just being the exclusive dominion of the Prime Minister.
There is also a general atmosphere of distrust, okay? You know, the winter fuel allowance, the WASPI women thing. I mean, whatever you think of those individually as issues, there's been a series of things that basically have given the impression that Labour said one thing before it got elected and is now doing a different thing, or even occasionally the opposite thing. Do you think this is another blow in that direction and something that might be weaponized by a party like Reform, for instance, to say, look, they're all the same or whatever? And where does that leave us?
Yeah. He is building up the reputation, Starmer, of he is willing to say all sorts of things in an election that he isn't necessarily planning on doing afterwards. The WASPI women thing, I mean, the WASPI women thing it's legitimate in its own right, but you didn't need to go in support in opposition. The same, I would say, with the economy. They knew the state of the economy in opposition. They were signing up to Tory tax cuts, which they knew they couldn't afford, basically because of a sort of electoral cowardice of we don't want a dividing line over taxation. And then you get to the other side of the election and suddenly they're, getting into this insane protracted debate over have they or have they not raised taxes on working people by messing around with employers' national insurance. And the same you could say with the House of Lords. Not that anyone really cares about the House of Lords particularly. They didn't care about it when we promised to get rid of it, and they don't really care about it now. But nevertheless, it is the same picture. The honest truth is they did say one thing before the election, and now they are doing a separate thing. They still kind of say that eventually they're going to maybe get rid of it, but in the second term, no government gets into that kind of thing in their second term. If they weren't going to just, change the House of Lords right now, it's not ever going to really happen, I think. So he's definitely got that tendency in him, which of course he had during the Labour election campaign, where he really ran as a completely different candidate to the one that he ended up acting as leader of the opposition. I tend not to mind this too much because I'm generally pretty sympathetic towards him and I understand the choices that he's making as they go. But ultimately, you can only do this so many times before you get to a general election, for instance, in 5 years' time, and whatever you say is discounted because people say, well, it really doesn't matter what you say to us right now. You know, you're not someone with a track record on delivering on the things that you say you'll do at an election.
Yeah. I mean, his position is understandable. And yet the way he's going about it seems to be just the worst possible way to go about it. I was chatting to Zoe Williams earlier about the WASPI women thing, and we both have our individual doubts about the merit of the thing, but having allied yourself with them and saying, we're going to help you, to then turn around and do the opposite, it's really difficult to repair developing a reputation as an untrustworthy sort, basically. And so, since it is the last of 2024, can I ask you, just looking ahead, are we in territory where it might be possible to see Starmer not finishing this term as Labour Prime Minister? Might there come a time when the achievement and delivery, I guess, of Labour government is decent, but they're being held back by Starmer's reputation as someone who doesn't keep his word and might do better at the next election under new management, as it were?
No, I think absolutely not. And I've noticed this is starting to be talked about, but it's just one of these stories that nothing is happening. It's just that people talk and then, you know, so MPs, they're talking in the tea room and then they go back to a journalist and then the journalist says it. The journalist has a TV show, so they say it there and then more people talk and then someone writes a comment piece and then now we're talking about it. And it's just like, there is no news. Do you know what? Nothing is happening. It's just all happening. People are talking and then other people go, oh, look at them talking. And now we're talking and off we go. And the talk just grows and grows and grows and grows. And it's just a nothing. It's based on nothingness, on complete vacuity. He has just won like this extraordinary majority. He is the most consistently underestimated politician that I have seen in my life. Like, people cannot stop looking at him and just being like, oh, he's so boring. He's so uncharismatic. He's got no ideas. He's got no politics. He's got no connection to the public. You look at how Boris Johnson treated him with this utter disdain when he was Prime Minister and Starmer was leader of the opposition. And over again, Starmer kind of ignores how he's underestimated and just goes ahead and does really big, extraordinary things. And I think the funny place that we're at, like, there's loads to criticize him on, like, really justifiably. I've been doing it, you know, for the whole of the last sort of 5 minutes, and I could pick at least sort of 3 or 4 other things that I'd want to be quite cross about. And yet, I don't think it's just the manner that we underestimate him in terms of the election victory. It's also that some of the shit that they're doing in government right now is big. It is like generation big. I think when you look at what's going on in planning, when you look at the reforms of like Labour practices, when you look at local government, when you look at net zero, when you look at criminal justice, over and over, there are really, and I mean, by the way, the net zero thing, really, I mean, off the scale ambitious, huge system-wide change they're discussing there. We are just not talking, like, it's incredible how, particularly in the sort of mainstream press, there's almost no conversation about any of these things. And yet in 10, 15 years' time, we will look back on it and be like, my God, that was a really significant period of sort of full-scale engine room policy change. And apparently at the time, no one had anything to say about that whatsoever. So really, no, I don't think he's going to be going as Prime Minister. I don't think he's going to be going as Labour leader. I do think that he is perpetually underestimated and that is a process that is ongoing now in the press, even as he sits there with his massive majority.
I'm glad to hear you say this. I know you haven't listened to the Christmas episode yet, but I actually picked him as my person of the year, much to groans in the room. Because I just think that, you know, the collapse of the Tories and you know, the pandemic and the war in Ukraine, all of that is talked so much, and it's undoubtedly huge and has had a massive effect. But the fact remains that Starmer took over in March 2020, a party that was 22 points behind, and delivered an incredible majority 3.5 years later.
Yeah.
So, yes, I guess you're right. Underestimate him at your peril. Now, one last thing. I know you have feelings about some of the appointments that the Conservative Party put forward for the Lords.
Well, I mean, what is there to fucking, what is there to even fucking say? Like, I mean, she is such Kemi Badenoch. And like, if anyone was under any illusions as to just what a moron she is, surely that is put to rest now. Like, when you pick Toby Young, just this wittering little bellend, it has absolutely nothing of any consequence to say about any. I mean, you're right. You were right to pick me up in the middle of the things I have to say about Starmer's approach to the Lords, because even though all of it stands and it's genuinely disappointing, like you compare the quality of the people that he's talking about with the people the Tories are still putting in. Toby Young, just get a hold of yourself in the name of Christ. Like, it is extraordinary that she has done this, and it tells you like it's just case closed. Like we were told for quite a while, you read stuff in the Spectator and the Telegraph. Oh, she's really, she's this intellectual heavyweight. She really understands how to, just this forensic assault on left-wing identity politics and, the social mores of the current era. And then what is she really? She's basically another own the libs, cry your lib tears because I'm going to do another theatrical demonstration of my kind of populist wank. It's just, that is the most preposterous appointment done specifically from that whole own the libs, hyper online mentality. It is catastrophically fucking stupid. And even if she were to suddenly turn, which she will not, into an astonishingly impressive politician from now on, her reputation would still not be able to repair itself from the fact that she selected him.
The worry, of course, is that this leaves the door open to a sort of Musk money supercharged Nigel Farage to just destroy the Conservative Party and take over as the right-wing main power in the country, which doesn't bear thinking about.
I
don't think it's likely. Just to preempt you, I don't think it's likely. I don't think it's probable. But there was a time a few months ago where I would say it's impossible. And I can't genuinely say that now. I can't say it's impossible.
You're right about that. I mean, look, it will, having a surging Farage, which will be the story of next year, because that's what the press wants to be the story. But also, I mean, it is just, there is enough empirical data to justify pursuing that when you look at the polling and, we've got local elections coming up. Having a surging, it's poison for the national conversation and it will put us further to the right. It's terrible. But that's the sort of conversational level. When it comes to what does it do electorally? The basic boring answer, I think, is still the correct one, which a surging reform puts the right in the position that the left is usually in. It just divides it. Like you look at the kind of home county place. Tomorrow for Christmas, I'll be going to Winchester. Like that is where I'll spend Christmas, and that's a place that will vote Tory a lot of the time. It's not ever going to vote for reform. You know what I mean? In the same way that it's never going to vote for Labour, it will always vote Lib Dem if it's not Tory. It's just really hard to build an electoral map that reform can win. And what they can do is split the right. So it's sort of one of those scenarios where electorally, it kind of almost guarantees government by the left for as long as that situation holds. Politically, it might be more pernicious.
Quiet riot.
And that's it for this last Sunday school of 2024. Feel better soon, Naomi.
Thank you, Alex. And thank you, our beautiful, wonderful listeners, for tuning in once more. If you'd like to pay for my lemsip, head over to ko-fi.com/quietriotpod to sign up as a monthly backer and get invites to January's editorial meeting, our various Ask Us Anything events that will be happening throughout the year, and more.
But if money's tight, then you can still help us grow. Share an episode with a friend who you think will like this podcast. We want to grow the Quiet Riot community in new directions.
And the second part of our Christmas special with Nigel and Nigella, all about food, will land on Christmas Eve. So don't forget to follow or subscribe in order to get that in your inbox automatically.
May you have the best festive period, however you celebrate it, whether with family or in blissful quiet solitude, whether religiously or non-religiously. We wish you the best break.
Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.
Quiet Riot is an audio production by Cooler Heads with Naomi Smith, Alex Andreou, and produced by Kenny Campbell. Music by Mariana Sangeeta, artwork by Simona Canelu, and edited by me, Alex Reese. Quiet Riot is a co-production with Sandstone Global.
Quiet Riot.
Themselves in of 3 or 4 blocks of roughly equal power that can't agree on anything. And I guess we'll get to find that out. I see Naomi has joined us, probably to say thank you to you in person, Ian.
She's alive!
She's alive!
She is barely alive.
Oh my God!
Poor love.
But I couldn't resist listening to you both. Hello.
This is... Oh, I'm so sorry. It's the most pathetic thing I've ever heard. This is incredible.
It's grim. It is properly grim, people.
Okay.
I actually feel like I might be getting sick just by hearing your voice.
Oh. I really hope not.
That's hilarious. I think we have our post-credit bit there. I don't think we need to look much further for anything. Okay, thank you, Ian. Thanks for filling in.